Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Imagine a love so deep that time and distance can't erase it, yet fear and pain threaten to keep it buried forever. Diep and James were once inseparable, but the weight of the past pulled them apart. Now, fate has brought them face to face once again. Will they find their way back to each other? Or will the scars of their past be too much to overcome? Stay with us until the end to find out. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more heartfelt stories like this. Diep stood under the gray sky, the pale sunlight barely touching the vast green fields around her. She felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Her hands gripped the light bag she carried, yet it felt as though her heart was the heaviest thing she carried. Money had long since run out, and with it, any hope of a quick solution. The road home seemed distant, and she had no idea when she would finally get there. Every step she took felt as though she was walking through thick mud, heavy and slow. Her thoughts wandered to her circumstances, the harshness of trying to make a living, day after day, with no end in sight. If only I had enough money, I could go back home, she thought. But the money wasn't there, and neither was the answer to her troubles. The endless stretches of farmland mirrored her own desolation, the horizon so far and unreachable. As she continued walking, a taxi approached. She hesitated but stepped forward, her tired feet leading her toward the driver. "Can you take me a little way?" she asked, her voice shaky. The driver shook his head. "Not enough money," he muttered. Yet, after a moment of silence, he relented. "I'll take you a short way." Diep climbed in, silently thankful. Yet the lingering feeling of hopelessness remained. The taxi drove on, the road ahead seemingly endless. Diep looked out the window, lost in her thoughts, knowing that with every mile, her hope of finding a way back was slipping further away. The silence between her and the driver was deafening, and the weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Diep entered the small roadside cafe, her tired body aching from the long walk. She sat down at a quiet table, wrapping her cold hands around a cup of hot tea, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. The cafe was nearly empty, the hum of distant conversations filling the air. She gazed out the window, lost in thought, when a familiar voice broke the silence. "Diep, is that really you?" Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to find James standing at the doorway, a mixture of surprise and hesitation in his eyes. Time seemed to freeze in that moment, and for a second, Diep could only stare at him. The years apart had seemed like a lifetime, and now here he was, just as she remembered but different. "James," she whispered, her voice tight in her throat. The sight of him brought a flood of emotions, memories she had locked away for so long. She had never expected to see him again. James took a few cautious steps toward her. "I've been searching for you. I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to find you again." Diep felt a knot form in her stomach. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. His presence stirred something deep inside her, a longing she hadn't felt in years, mixed with the pain of their past. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Do you still think about me?" James's voice cracked, a hint of vulnerability breaking through. Her chest tightened. She couldn't answer, but the truth hung in the air. Nothing between them would ever be the same again. James and Diep sat across from each other in the cafe, the once familiar silence now loaded with years of separation. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and neither seemed to know where to start. James reached for his coffee, his hands slightly trembling, but his eyes never left Diep. "I've thought about you every day," he finally said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never stopped looking for you, Diep. I know what we had, what we lost. I never wanted us to end like this." Diep felt a pang in her chest. Her gaze flickered to the table as she struggled to meet his eyes. "James," she began, her voice faltering. I don't know if I can do this. After everything that happened, how do we go back?" The weight of the past seemed to press down on her. She had buried her feelings for so long, convinced that moving on was the only way to survive. But now, facing him again, she realized just how much of her heart was still tied to him. "I never wanted to hurt you," James continued, his voice thick with regret. "I wasn't ready for what we had, but I swear I've changed. I'll make it right. I'll do whatever it takes." Diep looked up at him then, her eyes clouded with a mixture of longing and fear. Could she trust him again? Could she risk opening her heart to him, knowing the pain they had both endured? The answer wasn't clear, but the feelings were undeniable. The past was too complex, too raw, and yet in that moment she couldn't help but wonder if there was still a chance. The tension in the air thickened as Diep silently studied James. The man who had once held her heart was now a stranger, yet his presence stirred emotions she thought she had buried long ago. The warmth from her cup had long since faded, and the coldness of indecision began to creep into her bones. James waited for her response, his eyes searching her face with a quiet desperation. He had made his intentions clear, but Diep wasn't sure she was ready to let go of her fear. How could she trust again after everything they had been through? The years of separation had taught her to rely on herself, to protect her heart from the pain of the past. She had survived without him, and now that he was back, she wasn't sure if she could open herself to the possibility of hurt again. "I don't know if I can, James," she whispered, her voice trembling. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling as though she were on the edge of something dangerous, something she couldn't control. "I've spent so long convincing myself that I didn't need you, that I could move on." James's face softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but full of raw emotion. "You don't have to decide now. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm just asking for the chance to prove that I can be the man you need." Diep's heart ached as she looked into his eyes. She felt the pull, the old connection that had once been so strong. Yet the fear of making the wrong choice, of trusting him again, paralyzed her. The quiet storm inside her raged as she grappled with the weight of the decision. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, as Diep's mind raced. Her heart wanted to believe him, wanted to fall back into the comfort of James's embrace, but something inside her hesitated. She had rebuilt her life without him, learning to stand on her own. Could she really let him back in? Was she willing to risk everything again? James's voice broke through her thoughts, soft but firm. "Diep, I'm not asking you to forget everything we've been through, but I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never will." Diep's breath hitched as his words echoed in her chest. Her eyes flickered to the table, unable to meet his gaze, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of emotions. She had spent so many nights wondering about him, replaying their memories, wondering what might have been. And now, here he was, saying the very words her heart longed to hear. I don't know if I can love you the way I did before, Diep murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can let myself be vulnerable again. James reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers, waiting for her to make the next move. I'm not asking for that, Diep. I just want a chance to show you that I can be the man you deserve. I want to make it right. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since their reunion, she allowed herself to feel. The fear still lingered, but so did the love, the warmth that had once filled her soul. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. Not anymore. I don't know if I'm ready, she whispered, but her heart was already making the decision for her. Diep and James sat in the quiet of the cafe, the weight of their conversation settling between them like a fragile thread. Diep's heart still trembled with uncertainty, but beneath the fear there was a flicker of something else. A long-buried hope, something deep inside her that whispered, maybe this is the second chance I've been waiting for. James watched her intently, his gaze soft but filled with determination. He didn't speak, simply waited for her to find her words. Diep looked down at her hands, wrapped tightly around her cup, the warmth soothing her cold fingers. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet full of the vulnerability she had been hiding for so long. Scared that we'll fall back into the same mistakes, hurt each other again. James's voice was gentle but unwavering. I won't let that happen, Diep, he said. I'm not who I was before. I've learned, and I'm ready to make things right for both of us. His words, so simple yet so heartfelt, settled in her chest. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time, felt the walls inside her begin to crumble. There was a tenderness in his eyes that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new, something stronger than before. I don't know what the future holds, she murmured, her heart still uncertain. But I want to try. With you. James's smile was small but genuine, and he gently squeezed her hand. One step at a time, he promised. Together. In that moment, Diep allowed herself to believe. They could move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it, side by side. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of rediscovery. Diep and James spent time together in ways they hadn't before, each conversation a step toward healing. There were still moments of silence, moments when the weight of their past lingered in the air, but they were learning to navigate it together. One afternoon, James took Diep to meet his mother, who had been eagerly waiting for this reunion. When Diep walked into the house, she was met with warmth, but there was something else too. A sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about James. It was about returning to a place that had always felt like home, even if she hadn't realized it until now. As they sat at the dinner table, laughter filled the room. James's mother, smiling warmly at Diep, spoke softly. I've missed you, my dear. We've all missed you. Diep's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She had been lost for so long, and now, here she was, back in a place that could give her peace. Later, after dinner, James pulled her aside, his hand gently resting on hers. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft and sincere. Diep nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. I think I'm finally home, she said quietly. As they walked outside, the stars above them gleamed brightly, as if reflecting the newfound hope in their hearts. Diep leaned her head against James's shoulder, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to simply be, with him, with herself. The past was never truly gone, but maybe that was okay, because now they had each other.
Sau bao nhiêu khó khăn, Diệp cuối cùng cũng gặp lại James trong một buổi chiều mưa lất phất. Cả hai đã từng lạc mất nhau giữa biển hiểu lầm và bị John bắt. Diệp đã nhiều lần muốn buông bỏ và không quay trở lại, nhưng cuối cùng James cũng tìm được cô. Không còn là thích dài dòng, chỉ là một cái ôm thật chặt để đủ xóa nhòa khoảng cách của họ. Và họ hiểu rằng tình yêu chân thành luôn có cách để quay trở về, dù phải đi qua bao nhiêu giông bão và cuộc gặp gỡ ấy đã khẳng định cho là họ sẽ ra để dành cho nhau.